Nadia had 14 minutes to stop a man from bleeding out in a grain elevator, and the supervisor who just terminated her was standing 6 feet away, watching her do it. She had walked out of Clearwater Regional Hospital 40 minutes earlier with her badge in her coat pocket, and the specific kind of numbness that came after something you'd been dreading for months finally arrived and turned out to be worse than the dread. 7 years. 7 years of R shifts, of 12-hour stretches that turned into 14, of filing reports that went to a folder no one opened, of watching supply cabinets run short in ways that didn't add up and documenting it anyway, because that was what you did when something was wrong, and you knew how to write it down precisely. Dr. Gwen Sato had delivered the termination with the professional regret of someone who'd rehearsed it. Performance concerns. A pattern of conduct that had created friction with administration. A formal complaint that Nadia had never seen and wasn't permitted to review. Nadia hadn't argued. She'd learned early that arguments in those rooms produced paperwork that described you as difficult. She'd asked for the written record. She'd been told it would be emailed. She'd picked up her bag and walked down the corridor. She'd walked 10,000 times and pushed through the staff exit into the November dark. Saskatoon in November smelled like cold grain and distance. The prairie wind came off the fields east of the city and found every gap in your coat, and the parking lot of Clearwater Regional sat exposed to all of it, the overhead lights throwing pale cones down through the blowing snow. She was almost to her car when the black SUVs blocked the exit. 2 of them, no plates she could read in the dark, engines off but recently running, the exhaust still curling up from the tailpipes in the frozen air. Not parked, positioned. There was a difference, and she understood it immediately because she'd spent 3 years before nursing school working in remote field camps where the people responsible for security positioned vehicles exactly like this when they wanted to contain a situation before explaining it. She stopped walking. 4 figures came out of the dark. Civilian clothing, good boots, the kind of physical stillness that wasn't natural but trained. They spread without discussing it, the spacing deliberate, the geometry of the arrangement telling her everything she needed to know about what they did for a living. The one in front was maybe 45, close-cropped gray at his temples, eyes that caught the parking lot light and gave nothing useful back. Nadia Kovač, he said. Not a question. She looked at the 4 of them. She looked at the SUVs. She looked at the hospital entrance, which was behind all of them now. You're blocking the only exit, she said. We need a trauma nurse. His voice had the economy of someone who'd said difficult things in difficult circumstances and had stopped softening them because softening wasted time. There's been an incident. We have a man down and we don't have time to find someone else. There's an emergency department 30 meters behind you. We can't use it. He held her gaze. I understand that's not an explanation. I'll explain everything I can on the way. She was a trauma nurse. She'd spent 3 years of her 20s doing field rotations in remote industrial sites and 2 more as a flight nurse before she'd settled into hospital work. She'd assessed situations faster than this and made worse decisions under more pressure. She looked at the man's hands, at the way the others were standing. How long ago, she said. 18 minutes. Where? 3 minutes. She got in the SUV. His name was Yount. He gave it without being asked once they were moving, which she appreciated. The man beside her in the back, younger, with the blunt hands of someone who worked with them, told her what she was dealing with in the flat-clipped language of someone reporting a situation rather than experiencing it. Penetrating abdominal trauma, upper right quadrant, probable liver involvement. Pressure had been applied manually for the past 18 minutes. BP last read at 84/52. IV access established. 1 large bore. No fluids running because they didn't have the right setup. No blood product. Nadia did the math without trying. Liver lacerations bled fast and unpredictably. The vasculature up there was dense and unforgiving. At 84 systolic with 18 minutes already elapsed, the window was not comfortable. What do you have, she said. Military-grade trauma kit. Hemostatic gauze, chest seals, cat tourniquet, occlusive dressings, saline bags, 2 of them, but the lines aren't running right. She was already thinking about the lines. What are we going into? An agricultural facility, grain elevator complex east of the city. Abandoned. There's lighting set up, but it's not ideal. She'd worked in worse. She'd worked in a helicopter going sideways through a prairie thunderstorm on a man who'd lost 3 fingers to a combine. Abandoned grain elevator with tactical lights was not the hardest room she'd ever worked in. Nobody argues with me, she said. When I'm in that room, I make the calls. Nobody touches him without my direction. Nobody tells me what's possible or not possible. Is that clear? Yount turned just enough to meet her eyes in the dark. Clear, he said. The grain elevator was enormous and cold, the smell of old grain and machine oil deep in the concrete walls. Tactical lights on standing mounts threw hard white light across the floor, and in the center of that light a man was down on his back on a spread tarp, and another man knelt beside him with both hands pressed high on his abdomen, and the blood had soaked through the dressings, and the tarp had gone dark underneath him. His name was Theo. She found that out later. In the moment, she crossed the space at a controlled pace, not running because running communicated panic and panic was contagious, and dropped to her knees and got her hands on him and started working. He was conscious, barely, eyes tracking but slow. "My name is Nadia," she told him. "I'm a nurse. I'm here. Can you hear me?" His lips moved, close enough. The trauma kit was well stocked and well organized. Whoever had packed it knew what they were doing, even if they hadn't anticipated the specific anatomy of this injury. She talked while she worked, not to the patient but to the room. Directing the name was Croft. She gathered, from the way Yount said it once quietly, on how to shift his pressure, and when directing the others to hold, to elevate, to get the IV line running properly, because the kink in the tubing was the problem, not the access. The saline ran. She packed the wound with hemostatic gauze the way she'd been trained to do it, which was not the way that looked controlled, but the way that worked. And she directed Croft's hands to positions that maintained compression without compromising what she was doing. She'd done this in the back of a helicopter. She'd done this on the floor of a logging camp cookhouse with a headlamp and a kit that was missing half its contents. She'd done this years ago in circumstances she almost never talked about, in a country whose name she didn't say casually at dinner parties. She did it now. 11 minutes. 12. The bleeding slowed. Not stopped, but slowed, which was the difference between a number that was going the wrong direction and a number that had been persuaded to pause. His color changed. Slightly, but she'd been looking for it. She sat back on her heels. "He needs a surgical team," she said, "vascular and general, and he needs blood. He's stable enough to move, but the window is maybe 40 minutes. Who are you calling?" Yount was already on a radio. It was only then, with her hands still and Theo's breathing steadier under Croft's steady attention, that Nadia became aware of the room she was actually in. Not just the immediate radius of tactical lighting and trauma kit contents, but the space beyond it. She'd been focused the way she was always focused when someone needed her to be, which meant the peripheral world had existed but not registered. It registered now, stacked along the far wall, organized with the systematic precision of a supply operation rather than abandoned storage, were medical crates, dozens of them. Standard institutional medical supply packaging, the kind she'd been ordering and inventorying for 7 years, the kind whose absence she'd been documenting for the past 8 months in reports that kept going somewhere and doing nothing. She looked at them for 4 seconds. 4 seconds was enough. "Yount," she said, without looking away from the crates. He appeared at her shoulder. "How long have those been here?" He was quiet for a moment that told her something. "That's part of what we need to talk about," he said. She looked at him, then talk. They moved her to a room she hadn't noticed, a partitioned office space off the main floor, with a folding table and a laptop running on a satellite connection, and a woman seated at the table, who looked up when Nadia entered with the expression of someone who'd been waiting for a specific person, and recognized them. "My name is Biozalel," the woman said. "I'm with a federal investigations unit attached to Public Safety Canada. We don't maintain a public profile." She paused. "Sit down, Miss Kovač. I'll stand. That's fine." Biozalel turned the laptop. "What I'm about to show you is operationally sensitive. We're operating outside the formal warrant structure tonight for reasons that will become clear, but the sensitivity is equivalent to classified material. You understand what that means. It means you'd rather I didn't post it online." Biozalel looked at Yount. Yount looked at the ceiling. "More or less," Biozalel said, and pulled up the first document. It was a logistics manifest. Nadia recognized the format immediately, the header structure, the column arrangement, the item coding system. She'd processed documents like this hundreds of times. Standard medical supply inventory, IV consumables, surgical materials, trauma packing supplies, hemostatic agents, the ordinary unremarkable vocabulary of a hospital storeroom. But the destination codes were wrong. She leaned forward before she decided to. "These facility codes," she said. "These aren't hospital identifiers." "No, they're not. What are they?" "Shell companies," Biozalel said. "Registered federally, incorporated in Alberta and British Columbia, all within a 16-month window 2.5 years ago. On paper, they look like regional medical distribution intermediaries. In practice, they're receiving entities. The inventory arrives, gets reclassified on paper, and the physical stock moves again into private channels. Private channels meaning sold." Yount spoke from behind her. "Off-book to buyers who don't ask provenance questions." Nadia straightened. "Military supply in there too, some of it. Some is civilian hospital stock diverted before it reaches the ward level. The operation runs through both systems." Biozalel swiped to the next screen. "The civilian component is where Clearwater comes in." The next document was a procurement contract. Nadia's eyes went to the signatory line and then to the entity name at the top, and something in her chest did something that wasn't quite pain, but lived in the same neighborhood. Clearwater Regional Hospital. A procurement agreement with one of the shells, dated 22 months ago, 7 months before she'd been hired. They were running this before I arrived, she said. Yes, and the supply discrepancies I was documenting. Every one of them was real, Bishosalale said. You were logging inventory that had already been diverted at the source level. Your reports were being captured at the supervisory level and suppressed. Nadia was quiet for a moment. Dr. Sato, Bishosalale didn't confirm it directly, which was its own answer. You didn't get dismissed because you were a problem, Yount said. You got dismissed because you were good at your job, and your job kept producing accurate documentation that certain people had paid significant money to make sure didn't exist. She stood with that for a moment. The room was cold. Outside distantly, she could hear the helicopter rotors that had appeared. Sometime in the past few minutes, the heavy measured rhythm of a military aircraft settling somewhere near the complex. Not emergency services. The cadence was different. Who's at the top of it, she said. Biosalil pulled up a photograph. The man in it was late 50s, silver-haired, decorated in the specific way of someone who'd attended enough official functions that the decorations had become part of the furniture of his face. The kind of man whose photograph appeared in annual reports and government press releases and the backgrounds of ministerial announcements. Brigadier General Howard Strachan, Biosalil said. Canadian Forces Health Services Group. He controls medical supply procurement allocation for 3 operational commands and holds oversight authority over civilian hospital partnership agreements established under the Federal Community Health Integration Framework, which means he decides where everything goes, which means for the past 3 years a significant portion of what was supposed to go to deployed medical teams has been going sideways, Yount said. Nadia looked at the photograph. How much? Biosalil said the estimated total diverted value was somewhere between $30 and $50 million. The number was large enough to feel abstract. Nadia translated it the way she always translated numbers, into units of hemostatic gauze, into units of blood product, into trauma kits that weren't where they were supposed to be when someone reached for them in the dark. What do you need from me, she said. What they needed took Biosalil 40 minutes to explain, and Nadia sat down halfway through because standing started to feel performative. Theo's team had been running a covert evidence-gathering operation, documenting the physical storage points where diverted supplies were held between transfers. Tonight's operation had been compromised. One operator had not made it out. Theo was alive because of Nadia, but his condition meant their primary evidence chain was broken. The civilian connection ran through Clearwater's procurement records, specifically through a series of purchase orders generated over an 18-month window, signed off at the administrative director level. Nadia said the name before Biosalil could, Gareth Monahan. Biosalil looked at her. Administrative director. He has authority over procurement. She dealt with Monahan twice in 7 years, both times in the specific way of someone presenting a surface of cooperative professionalism while communicating through every other signal that the conversation was already over before it began. He keeps distance from anything direct. Everything goes through his office, but nothing is traceable back to him personally. We know, Biosalil said. That's why we need the discrepancy reports. Your reports from the past 8 months create a contemporaneous record of inventory anomalies that map directly onto the diversion timeline. If we can recover the original filed versions with their timestamps and routing metadata, we can establish that hospital administration received documented evidence of irregular activity and chose to suppress it. That's not administrative failure. That's conspiracy. Those reports were filed through the hospital's internal quality management system, Nadia said. Yes, which I no longer have access to as of approximately 2 hours ago. We know. Biosalil folded her hands. We have technical access from outside, but we need you to walk our analysts through the filing architecture. The institutional knowledge is the piece we're missing. Nadia thought about the 8 months of reports. The specific language she'd used because she'd learned quickly that imprecise language disappeared without a trace. She'd been exact. Item codes, receiving dates, signature discrepancies, cross-referenced against order confirmations. She'd written those reports like legal documents because she'd wanted them to be taken seriously. She'd had no idea how seriously they would eventually be taken. Tell me what you need, she said. They worked through the rest of the night with an analyst named Drummond, voice only through the satellite connection, who walked her through the hospital system's internal architecture while she narrated it from memory. It's under compliance documentation, not supply chain management, she told him, which makes no administrative sense, but that's where it is. Subfolder 2. Variance reporting, then sorted by department code. Our flagged items are under a separate subcategory labeled Operational Discrepancies. I'm in the Compliance Directory, Drummond said. I see variance reporting. Going in now. He paused. I'm looking at flagged items attributed to your employee credentials. Another pause, longer. There are 31 reports here. Nadia said I filed 44. The silence that followed had a specific shape. 13 reports are missing from the active record, Drummond said. Looking at the date gaps. The missing reports would fall in January-March, 2 in May, 3 in July, and then 6 in September and October. January and March were when she'd shifted from informal verbal flagging to formal written documentation. May was when she'd found the procurement code anomaly that hadn't matched any authorized supplier in the system and had escalated it through every available channel. September and October were when the formal performance review process had begun. They pulled the ones that built the clearest picture, she said. 13 reports pulled, Drummond confirmed. But deleted files aren't gone. They're just unindexed. Running a metadata recovery search now. Another pause. They're here. All 13. Someone removed them from the active directory but didn't purge the underlying data. Either they were working fast or they didn't understand how the system worked at the infrastructure level. Can you recover them? Already doing it. Give me 10 minutes. It was closer to 16, but Drummond delivered all 13 reports intact, with original timestamps and routing metadata showing exactly where they'd been filed, who the automated notification chain had flagged, and the part that made Bioslale go very still, a read confirmation showing that 4 of the reports had been opened and reviewed at the administrative director level within 72 hours of filing. Monahan's personal credentials, his session identifier, his timestamp. He'd read the reports documenting the inventory irregularities. He'd read them, and then he'd deleted them, and then he'd begun the process of building a performance case against the nurse who'd written them. Nadia looked at that timestamp for a long time. What she felt wasn't satisfaction. It was something more complicated. A kind of grief, maybe, for the 8 months she'd spent telling herself the quieter version of events. The one where she'd simply run into institutional friction, where the system was simply imperfect, where she'd simply had bad luck with a supervisor who didn't value the same things she did. That version had been easier to carry than this one. This one's meant she'd been right. Every single time. Upload the recovered files to the secure server, Bioslale said. All 13 plus the intact 31. Already uploading, Drummond said. Bioslale looked at Nadia. Are you all right? No, Nadia said. But that's not the relevant question right now. The decryption of Theo's recovered drive took longer. The procurement code she'd flagged in her May report, a supplier identifier she hadn't recognized, and had escalated with the full string because she'd wanted it traceable, contained a fragment that matched the drive's encryption architecture. It didn't give Drummond's team the full key, but it gave them enough scaffolding to reconstruct it. At 4:17 in the morning, the drive opened. What came out of it was 3 years of operational records, transaction data, supply chain logs, financial transfers, communications. The working infrastructure of the operation, preserved because operations required it to function, not because anyone had intended it to be found. Bioslale worked through it with Drummond while Nadia sat against the wall with a bottle of water and watched the window. There was a small high window in the room, and the black in it went the particular dense blue of very early morning and then began almost imperceptibly to lighten. 11 names, Bioslale said at some point. Strachan's at the top, Yount said. His authorization signature is on the primary diversion orders. The others were run through cutouts, but the document trail leads back to him. This is enough to start moving, Bioslale said. Yount stepped out of the room with his phone. Nadia listened to the quiet that followed. She was tired in the way that went past physical. The adrenaline had metabolized into something flat and strange. She thought about Theo, who'd been taken somewhere around 2 in the morning, destination not given, Croft riding with him. She thought about the operator who hadn't made it out of wherever they'd come from before the grain elevator. Yount had said it once briefly, the way people said things they'd already processed as much as they could afford to in the field. She hadn't asked for a name. Names came later when there was room for them. Yount came back. His face had something different in it now, under the operational composure. Strachan knows the operation was compromised, he said. He's initiating a document clearance protocol at his office, and he's been in contact with Clearwater administration, specifically with Monahan. Nadia was on her feet before she'd finished deciding to stand. He's telling them to clear anything that can be connected to the civilian side, she said. We believe so. Monahan's building access was logged at 4:03. She stopped. He's already there. Yes. And we don't have the warrant in place yet for the hospital. The federal warrant process for a civilian healthcare facility requires how long? Yount held her gaze. Longer than Monahan has been in that building. The room was quiet for a moment. Bioslale said, slowly, there is one way into that building right now that doesn't require the warrant. Nadia looked at her. Your access credentials were deactivated at the system level at midnight, Biozalil said. But under Clearwater's own human resources protocol, the physical access card of a terminated employee is retained in the security office for 72 hours pending formal administrative processing in case of appeal or dispute. Standard policy. I know the policy. If someone were to present that card at the overnight security desk and request access to retrieve personal property from a secure locker, a documented, routine, procedurally legitimate reason, the overnight officer would most likely contact HR to verify. HR doesn't respond to after-hours calls for 60 to 90 minutes. That creates a window. Nadia looked at Yount. He reached into his jacket and set her Clearwater Regional Access card on the table. She looked at it, her photograph, her name, the hospital logo she'd walked past 10,000 times. She picked it up. I need someone on comms, she said, and I need to know which office Monahan uses and what the administrative wing layout looks like at 4:30 in the morning. I can give you all of that, Drummond said through the laptop. Still connected. One more thing, Yount said. His voice had a texture she hadn't heard in it before. 2 additional credential swipes registered at Clearwater's east entrance 4 minutes after Monahan entered. The credentials are flagged as inactive in the system. She looked at him. He brought people with him, she said. We don't know who yet. But inactive credentials used for physical access at 4 in the morning means someone who knows the building and has resources to obtain legacy card data. Her hand was already on the card. She left the grain elevator through the side door. The SUV was running. Outside it was still fully dark, the November sky black and enormous the way prairie skies were, the city lights a low orange smear to the west. The temperature had dropped while they'd been inside, and the cold had that specific clean quality of late autumn before the deep freeze set in that she'd always found clarifying. Yount drove. Neither of them spoke. The city came up around them, gradually, the industrial edge of the east side giving way to residential streets, and then the wider arterials that led toward the hospital district. The streets were empty in the specific way of a city not yet awake. Traffic lights cycling for no one, Drummond in her earpiece, calm and immediate. Monahan is in the administrative wing, 2nd floor. He's been stationary in the director's suite for 9 minutes. Overnight security is Officer Hess. He's worked the overnight desk for 2 years. He knows your face. She put the small earpiece in as they came around the corner that brought the hospital into view. Clearwater Regional at 4:30 in the morning was lit in the upper floors and dark in the lower, the ER entrance glowing amber at the base the way it always did. I'm also seeing 2 individuals on the 2nd floor moving toward Monahan's location, Drummond said. Can't confirm identity yet from camera coverage. Yount pulled to the side entrance lot and stopped. Tanner, she said. There was a beat. Drummond, the 2 unknowns. She said, they're between me and Monahan already, working on ID. 30 seconds she got out of the car. The staff entrance had a keypad and a card reader, and she'd used both thousands of times. Her hands went to them before her mind had fully caught up. The card touched the reader beeped. The light stayed red. She'd expected that. Was the specific feeling of standing in front of a door that used to open for her and watching it refuse in the pre-dawn dark. 7 years compressed into one small red light. She pressed the intercom. Clearwater Security, a voice said. Overnight. Officer Hess, it's Nadia Kovač. I was on staff until last night. I left some personal things in my locker when I processed out and I need to get them. A pause. Not suspicious. Tired. Miss Kovač. His voice had the texture of a man recalculating his evening. You know I have to log this, I know. I just need 10 minutes. Come around to the main lobby. I'll buzz you through. She walked around. Yount's voice in her earpiece. Drummond has the 2 unknowns on camera now. Moving toward the director's suite. Can't confirm affiliation yet, but their movement pattern is deliberate. The main lobby doors unlocked with a heavy click. Hess was at the security desk with his reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, and the expression of a man who'd been on duty for 6 hours and was about to deal with something that would require him to write a supplementary report. Officer Hess, she said, is there anyone else in the building tonight who came in after midnight? Administrative access logs separately from my desk, he said. That's not something I'm not asking for names. She stopped at the desk. Did you see anyone come through after midnight who wasn't on the overnight roster? His jaw moved. His eyes went briefly to the stairwell door at the back of the lobby. Mr. Monahan came in around 4. That happens sometimes when there's an administrative matter. 2 others came through the east entrance. I didn't recognize them. She held his gaze. Officer Hess. If something is happening in this building right now that shouldn't be happening, you need to not be standing between whoever it is and the exit when this resolves. Call Saskatoon Police right now. Not hospital administration. The police. Unauthorized individuals in the building outside of security clearance. That's all you need to say. He looked at her for 3 seconds. Then he reached for his phone. She went for the stairs. The second-floor administrative corridor at 4:40 in the morning was lit by the overnight setting, every third overhead panel, the kind of institutional dimness that made the tile look gray instead of white, and turned the framed mission statements on the wall into dark rectangles with the suggestion of text. Nadia knew this corridor. She'd been up here 9 times in 7 years, each visit to follow up on a report that had generated no response. Drummond in her ear, Monahan is still in the director's suite, east end of the corridor, last door before the fire exit. The two unknowns. He paused. They just stopped moving. They're on your floor. I don't have camera coverage in the east corridor. Only stairwells and lobby. She kept walking. Her footsteps were deliberate but not stealthy. Stealth in a building where she'd worked for 7 years would look wrong if anyone saw her, and looking wrong was a liability. She could see light under the last door, a thin bright line at the base. She could also see, 40 feet further down, in the recessed area where the corridor met the fire exit access, 2 shapes that weren't furniture. Standing still, one of them turned its head slightly, and the dim corridor light caught a face for half a second male. Mid-40s, the kind of physical stillness that was learned rather than natural. These were not hospital staff. Nadia turned, unhurried, and knocked on Monahan's door. "Mr. Monahan, it's Nadia Kovač." The silence that followed lasted long enough to be a decision. "Come in," he said. Gareth Monahan at 4:40 in the morning was not the version of Monahan that appeared in hospital communications and annual stakeholder reports. His jacket was off. His desk was covered in papers in the disrupted way of someone moving through them fast, pulling some, stacking others, the specific disorder of someone who had made a decision and was executing it. He looked at her. His face did something that he managed to suppress before it fully formed. But she'd caught the edge of it. "This is irregular." "I left some things in my locker," she said. "I couldn't sleep." "Your locker is in the staff wing." "I know. I wanted to stop here first." She made it obvious she was looking at his desk. "Since we didn't get to speak when HR processed me out last night, there's nothing to discuss. The termination was documented." "Everything here is very documented," she said. "That's actually what I wanted to ask about. Some of my variance reports from the past 8 months have gaps in the active record. 13 reports that should be there aren't." The color in his face shifted. "System data retention has occasional gaps. That's an IT matter. You personally reviewed 4 of those reports within 72 hours of filing." She said it evenly. "I have the session log showing your credentials and the timestamp." Drummond's voice in her ear, barely there. The 2 individuals are moving. Coming toward Monahan's office. She kept her eyes on Monahan. "Did you review my reports, Mr. Monahan?" He stood up from behind his desk. Not aggressive. Repositioning. The move of a man who was creating options. "Ms. Kovač, you need to leave this building, whatever you think you're doing." "I called the police on my way up," she said. "Hess is already on with them." It was half true. Hess had been calling when she'd left the lobby. Monahan's face changed. The professional surface shed itself. What was underneath wasn't rage. It was calculation at its operational core. "You've made a serious mistake," he said. "Several probably," she said. "Not about this." The door opened. The 2 men who came in were not hospital security. She'd known that from the corridor and confirmed it now. Their build, their hands, the way they filled the doorway without announcing themselves. The older one had the face she'd half seen in the corridor. The younger one had a haircut that said recent military service and eyes that said currently employed elsewhere. The younger one looked at Monahan. "We need to move. The window is closing." Monahan looked at Nadia. She called the police. A pause. The older man's eyes went to her. She was calculating the distance to the door, calculating the desk between her and Monahan. The phone on the desk was a hospital landline, wired through the switchboard. She was calculating what she actually had, which was an earpiece. "Drummond," she said clearly, as though addressing someone in the room. "Are you getting all of this?" The older man moved, not toward her, past her, to the landline. He pulled the cord from the wall in one clean motion. Then he stopped and looked at her, at her ear. "Who are you talking to?" he said. "People who are listening," she said. His right hand moved to his jacket. What came out of it answered a question she'd been keeping in the back of her mind since she'd come through the lobby. She put her hands up, not from fear. Fear was there, but organized, filed away where it had to wait. She put her hands up because there was nothing tactically useful in pretending she had options she didn't have. "Yount," she said. "Second floor administrative east wing. Now would be good." No response in her ear. She didn't know if the signal was gone or if Yount had been monitoring the whole time and was already moving. Monahan was gathering papers into a folder with the focused speed of someone on a clock. "Get her out of the building," he said to the older man, separately. "That means different things to different people," Nadia said. "It means we go somewhere quiet and have a conversation about what you think you know and what you'd like your situation to look like," the older man said. His voice was entirely reasonable. "We're not looking for complications." "Then you came to the wrong building," she said. Drummond crackled back into her ear, faint, fighting interference. Federal units, Yount is in the building. 2 minutes. 2 minutes was both very short and very long, depending on what happened in it. The younger man was at the window now. She heard something from outside, felt it rather, a low vibration that could have been a vehicle or something else. Someone's outside, the younger man said. The older man's attention fractured for a fraction of a second, the way attention shifted between competing threats, and Nadia moved. Not toward the door, toward the desk. She put both hands flat on the papers. Monahan was gathering and pushed, not dramatically. She just pushed, and the papers went in 4 directions, and Monahan grabbed for them and missed half, and in the 3 seconds of that scramble, she had her phone out and was taking photographs. The paper that landed face up in front of her was a financial transfer record. She couldn't read all of it, but she caught a shell company name she recognized from Biosoleil's briefing. Caught a dollar figure with 6 zeros. Caught a date stamp from 9 days ago. She took a third photograph. The older man had her arm. Professional. The kind of grip designed to move someone without leaving marks. Give me the phone, he said. Tell me your name first, she said. If we're going somewhere quiet, I'd like to know who I'm talking to. Kinnear, he said, then looked briefly annoyed at himself for answering. Kinnear, she said clearly. And Monahan. And a financial transfer document dated 9 days ago. He took the phone cleanly from her hand. We're leaving, he said. She let him walk her toward the door because the door was where she needed to be. Her hands were at her sides. Heart rate elevated, but not unmanageable. Her body remembered this. Remembered the specific grammar of situations where the right move was patience and waiting for the geometry to change. They reached the stairwell door. Kinnear pushed it open and stopped. Coming up the stairs, not rushing, moving with a particular grounded certainty of people who had the legal authority to be anywhere in the building they chose, were 2 individuals in federal windbreakers with identification already visible. Behind them, an officer in Saskatoon Police Service uniform. Behind him, Yount. Yount looked at Nadia, then at Kinnear, then at what was in Kinnear's hand, which was still visible. Put it down, Yount said in the voice of someone who'd said this before and understood its full grammar. The stairwell was quiet for a moment. Kinnear made the calculation that experienced people made when the geometry had definitively shifted and placed the weapon on the stair railing. Grip first, slowly. Nadia exhaled. Monahan is in his office, she said. Papers on the desk and floor. Don't let anyone touch them before the positions are documented. There are financial transfer records. I got 3 photographs before Kinnear took my phone. She looked at his jacket pocket. One of the federal agents stepped forward. The phone came back to her. She checked the photographs, all 3 intact. The phone had auto-uploaded to cloud backup the moment she'd taken them. She'd set that up 18 months ago after she'd lost a run of photographs when her phone had died on a camping trip. The most mundane possible decision, the most useful possible backup. She went and sat down on the stairs. Her legs didn't shake. They wanted to. She didn't argue with them. The next 2 hours happened around her in the organized rhythm of multiple agencies descending on a location that wasn't designed for it. Monahan was walked out of his office 20 minutes after the stairwell confrontation without his folder, flanked by federal agents, wearing the expression of a man whose planning had been built around a version of this morning that no longer existed. He looked at Nadia as they passed her in the corridor. She looked back. She didn't say anything. There was nothing that needed saying. Kinnear and the younger man, whose name she eventually learned was Deschênes, were processed in the lobby. Yount found her in a small conference room off the lobby, where someone had left coffee that she hadn't asked for but picked up because it was something warm. Drummond recovered everything before the connection dropped, Yount said. All the financial documents on Monahan's desk were photographed in situ by the forensic team. The 3 photographs on your phone are being added to the evidence chain. He sat down. The drive is in federal custody. Decryption was confirmed complete at 4:51. Strachan's name is attached to 97 individual transactions over a 34-month period. He paused. Theo is in surgery at a military medical facility as of an hour ago. The vascular team said the stabilization work you did was... He stopped, choosing words carefully. They said it was the reason he had a viable repair window. She nodded. She didn't need the credit. She was glad he was alive. Strachan, she said, initiated a travel authorization to CFB Shiloh at 4 a.m. He's still on base. Federal investigators are en route with a warrant. He thinks tonight's operation failed. He doesn't know about the drive. He has about 30 minutes, she said. The coffee was bad. Overnight cycle institutional coffee was always bad. She drank it anyway. I want to ask you something, Yount said. Ask. The procurement code in your May report. The flagged supplier identifier. You genuinely didn't know what it was when you filed it. I told you I didn't. I know. I want to understand why you kept escalating it. You'd had 6 reports go nowhere. Your director was actively working against your credibility. You had every rational incentive to stop. She looked at the coffee cup. Before this, she said, I worked as a flight nurse for 2 years. And before that, field rotations in remote sites. And before all of that, when I was 24, I spent a year doing volunteer trauma nursing in a conflict zone that I signed a confidentiality agreement about. She hadn't said that to anyone at Clearwater. It was a part of her life she kept separate because it was easier and because people asked questions about it that she didn't always have good answers to. In that year, I worked in a field hospital that kept running short on supplies. Not because of logistics failures, because things kept disappearing before they arrived. She looked at him. I didn't understand why at the time. I just knew what it meant when the shelf was short. I knew what it meant in practice, in terms of outcomes, in terms of people. So when I got to Clearwater and started seeing numbers that didn't add up, I didn't need to understand the full picture to know that missing supplies had names, real people on the other end. She looked at him directly. So I kept filing because I couldn't reconcile myself to stopping. That's all it was. Yount was quiet for a moment. You should have been read into this investigation 6 months ago, he said. It was as close to an apology as she thought he was capable of. You didn't know about me 6 months ago. We knew about the reports. We found them in the suppressed record. He looked at the table. We didn't connect the name to the person. We had 14 active threads and we missed the one person inside the building who was doing the work we should have been doing. She absorbed that without inflating it. What happens now? We process the evidence chain. Strachan gets arrested. The Strachan hospital side will be a separate federal action. Clearwater's operating status will be reviewed under the Health Authority investigation, which means the administrative structure, the board, the director's office, the procurement department, will be subject to federal oversight. His eyes met hers. You'll be contacted by the federal prosecutors within 72 hours. Your documentation and testimony will be central to the civilian prosecution. She thought about the hospital, about the ER she'd walked into and out of for 7 years, about the overnight nursing staff who'd had nothing to do with any of this and would now go to work tomorrow into an institution whose future was being decided in federal offices in Ottawa. The patients, she said. Federal oversight requires continuity of care. The ER won't close. That's not what I asked. I know, he said. I don't have a better answer than that one right now. She nodded. The conference room door opened. Biozalel, phone in her hand, something different in her face, not urgency, but the specific expression that accompanied information that changed the shape of what you were dealing with. We have a problem, Biozalel said. Strachan isn't at CFB Shiloh anymore. He left base at 4:20 in a private vehicle. No driver, no notification to base command. His phone last pinged a tower on Route 11 heading toward Saskatoon. She held up her phone. He knows. Someone in the network tipped him after the grain elevator was compromised. Nadia was on her feet. He's coming here, she said. We believe he knows the civilian documentation trail runs through Clearwater and through the one person who has both the institutional knowledge and the testimony to close the loop on the civilian side. Biozalel looked at her. He's not coming for documents. The bad coffee was cold. Nadia set it down. Tell me you have people between that highway and this building. Yount was already on his radio. The answer that came back in a burst of broken transmission landed in the room the way a stone landed in still water. Not yet, and then every light in the building cut out. The emergency generators engaged 6 seconds later. The conference room filled with red standby light, the particular dim crimson of a large building running on backup power. In that light, Nadia looked at Yount and saw on his face the expression of a man who understood exactly what a deliberate power interruption at a federal crime scene meant. It meant Strachan was already here. Yount was moving before the emergency lighting had stabilized. Hand on Nadia's arm, directional, not grabbing, and 2 words into his radio that she understood were a pre-established signal from the immediate, coordinated response they produced. The federal agents from the stairwell were already in the corridor outside, positioned with the instinctive spacing of people who didn't need to discuss the geometry. Stay close, Yount said. I need to know where you are. She understood the logic. She moved with him. The corridor was red-lit and strange. 7 years of knowing this building, and it looked like a different building in the emergency lighting. Same floor plan, different world. Where's Hess? She said. Lobby. He's okay. Yount's voice was controlled. Power cut was external. The main junction is on the east side of the building, around the corner from the loading access. This isn't a system failure. Someone who knows this building's infrastructure. Or someone who spent 10 minutes with the building permit documentation, she said, which is publicly available for any commercial structure built in Saskatoon after 1995. Both of them looked at her. He spent a career requesting classified facility security assessments for legitimate operational purposes, she said. He knows what to look for and he knows how to find it fast. Biozalel was already on her phone. Local police have the building perimeter. 3 units. She lowered the phone. We don't have a confirmed entry point yet. There's a blind spot in the exterior camera coverage on the north side, Nadia said. between the loading dock camera and the corner of the rehabilitation wing. About 25 feet. She'd noticed it during a security walkthrough 2 years ago that she'd attended as the ER staff safety representative. The gap had been flagged in the report and deprioritized because the budget cycle was closing. North side, Biosalil said into her phone, and walked. What happened next took 9 minutes in real time and felt like both longer and shorter than that. Strachan came in through a maintenance access door adjacent to the loading dock. The door required a key that Clearwater's facilities department had reported missing 7 weeks ago, filed under administrative nuisance, never escalated. He was in civilian clothes, dark jacket, dark trousers. He moved through the building's lower level with the purposeful quiet of someone who'd spent decades practicing purposeful quiet in places where it mattered. He was 62 years old. He moved like he was 45. Nadia wasn't there for the interception. Yount had her in the second-floor conference room with a federal agent and explicit instructions that she followed because she understood the tactical logic and because her legs were finally asking her to sit down. She heard it, though, or heard the specific shaped absence of sound that followed containment rather than the alternative. Yount's voice in her earpiece. We have him. Secure. She put her head back against the wall and closed her eyes for exactly 3 seconds. Then she stood up. There was still more to do. Brigadier General Howard Strachan in person was different from the photograph. Biosalil had shown her in the grain elevator. The photograph had been institutional, pressed uniform, chest full of decorations, the public-facing architecture of authority maintained over decades. The man they brought up to the second-floor conference room was the same face, the same military bearing that didn't dissolve entirely even now, but something had been stripped from it. The assumption of protection, maybe. He looked at Nadia the way people looked at things they hadn't expected to find in their path. She looked back. There was a long history of men like Howard Strachan looking at people like Nadia Kovač and not seeing anything worth calculating. She'd understood that for most of her adult life. She'd built a professional methodology around it. Document everything, be exact, be persistent. Let the work speak because work could be measured objectively and people often could not. She'd applied that methodology in a field hospital in a country whose name she didn't say at dinner parties. She'd applied it in 7 years of ER nursing. She'd applied it in 8 months of filing reports that went into folders that no one opened. The work had spoken every time. The people receiving it had simply chosen not to listen. That was a different thing. Miss Kovač, Strachan said. His voice was measured. Whatever he felt, he had enough practice at control that it stayed below what was visible. I did what I know how to do, she said. Document accurately and tell the truth. They'll build their case around your testimony, he said. You understand what that means. Years of federal proceedings. I know what federal proceedings look like, she said. I've read case files on military medical supply irregularities that stalled because the evidence chain was incomplete. I always wondered why they stalled when they did. She paused. Now I have a better picture. Something moved across his face. Not guilt, but the second cousin of it. The acknowledgement of someone who has been accurately read. The rest of it happened quickly. Biosalil entered with her phone showing the federal arrest warrant that had just been issued. Civilian federal court, not military tribunal. The distinction mattered in ways that Strachan's legal team had clearly not fully planned for, and watching him understand that was its own particular thing to observe. He asked for his lawyer. He was told access would be arranged within the hour. They walked him out. The next 4 hours were documentation and formal statement. The grinding procedural work of federal process that required precision when your body wanted to stop. Nadia gave her statement to a federal crown prosecutor named Ajay, who was thorough and wrote everything down twice. She walked him through 7 years and 8 months of documentation in the flat, detailed language of someone who'd learned to be useful to a record rather than expressive for an audience. At one point, Ajay asked whether she'd understood the legal risks of entering the hospital building that morning. I understood them, she said. And you went in anyway. Someone was destroying evidence that I had spent 8 months producing. She paused. I watched accurate documentation get suppressed for 8 months. I wasn't willing to watch it happen again when I was standing close enough to stop it. Ajay wrote that down too. Biosalil found her at 9 in the morning on a bench in the main lobby, watching the first shift arrive at the building where 3 federal agencies were processing the administrative wing. The nurses and technicians and orderlies who came through the staff entrance did so with the slightly stunned expressions of people arriving at work to find their institution had become something else overnight. The ER was running. She could see the entrance from where she sat. There was a backup in the waiting area, normal for a Tuesday morning, the ordinary urgent machinery of people who needed care continuing on its own unbroken logic, regardless of what was happening 1 floor up. She wanted to go in, not for any strategic reason, just because that was what she did. That was where she knew how to be. She stayed on the bench. She wasn't a Clearwater employee. The legal situation around her presence was already complicated enough. Strachan's legal team filed initial paperwork at 10, Biosolale said, sitting beside her. They're going to argue evidentiary chain issues on the drive and characterize the administrative suppression as routine discretionary management. His lawyer is already requesting a meeting with the federal prosecution. That's not what you do when you think you can win, Nadia said. No, Biosolale said. It's not. They were quiet for a moment. The ER entrance. There's something you should know, Biosolale said. The operator who didn't make it out of the previous location. His name was Tebow. He was 27. He'd been with the unit for 14 months. Nadia said nothing for a moment. The drive that he recovered, she said. Yes, his last operational action. Biosolale's voice was careful. The decrypted contents are the foundation of every warrant issued today. Tebow, 27, had carried the evidence that was currently dismantling a 34-month operation, and he'd done it in the last minutes of his life without knowing if anyone would ever extract it. She held that. She didn't try to make it smaller. The procurement code you flagged in May, Biosolale said. You escalated it through every available channel, even after the first 3 went nowhere. Yes, why? Most people would have stopped. Nadia looked at the ER entrance. Because I knew what a short shelf meant, she said, in practice. Not abstractly. I knew what it cost on the other end. She looked at Biosolale, so I kept filing because I couldn't let myself stop. That's all it was. Not heroism. Stubbornness and the inability to rationalize a gap in the supply cabinet. Biosolale was quiet for a moment. There's something else you should know, she said. The investigation is being reviewed at the federal level for scope expansion. Nadia looked at her. We believe Strachan's operation is not his first. There's a pattern in the supply irregularity records going back approximately 11 years. 3 prior incidents, all handled internally, all resulting in the departure of the personnel who flagged them. The people who earlier cases encountered career disruption shortly afterward. 2 are still in healthcare. 1 retired. 1, Biosolale's voice was careful, is deceased. Officially natural causes. The lobby was very quiet around her. You're telling me this wasn't isolated? No. And we want to revisit those earlier cases. With the evidence chain from today's operation, and with testimony from someone who understands both the clinical and the documentation side of what was happening. She paused. One of the individuals who flagged the second incident 9 years ago, she's currently working as a nurse manager at a hospital in Manitoba. She doesn't know that what she reported was part of something larger. She doesn't know that her departure from her previous position was engineered. Biosolale's voice took on a particular quality. She should know, and she should have a choice about what she does with that knowledge. Nadia looked at the ER entrance. A paramedic unit had just pulled in fast. The automatic doors, the amber light. Send me everything you have, she said, all the prior cases. We'd like to do that in person, Biosolale said. When? I can have the full file here by this evening. Nadia looked at the pale November light coming through the lobby glass. I'll be here, she said. She hung up the preliminary call that followed with the Federal Crown Counsel's office and sat with the quiet that settled when everything that had been in tension for 8 months. Longer, maybe. Longer than she'd been willing to count. Finally resolved into something that wasn't peace, exactly, but was the specific exhaustion of a structure that had been under pressure for a very long time and had finally been allowed to rest. Things that had been wrong were in the process of being corrected. People who had caused deliberate harm were facing proportionate consequences. It wasn't clean. It never was. Real resolution didn't feel like the end of a story. It felt like stepping out of something you'd been inside for so long you'd forgotten it had an outside. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. Ottawa area code. Ms. Kovač. A woman's voice. Formal. The cadence of someone who gave briefings for a living. My name is Director Chamberlain. I'm with the Federal Audit and Oversight Accountability Branch. I've been monitoring the Saskatoon situation since approximately 3 this morning, and I've reviewed Agent Yount's preliminary report. All right, Nadia said. I'll be brief. I believe what you've helped expose today is connected to a pattern that extends well beyond this operation. We've identified 3 prior incidents spanning 11 years. In each case, the individual who flagged the irregularities encountered career interference shortly afterward. We want to revisit all of them. She paused. There's also a name in the authorization chain of the second incident from 9 years ago. A name that has since moved considerably further up the institutional structure. We're still confirming, but if the connection is what we believe it to be, the scope of this investigation changes significantly. Nadia was very still. How far up, she said. Far enough that I'm driving to Saskatoon tonight with physical files rather than transmitting them electronically. She stood up from the bench. I'll have a room ready, she said. Director Chamberlain arrived at 7:15 that evening with 2 staff members and a briefcase she carried herself. They sat in the same conference room where Nadia had drunk bad coffee and watched Howard Strachan understand that he was finished. The files covered a table. The name in the authorization chain from the second incident, the suppression order on a nurse manager's report 9 years ago, belonged at the time to a mid-level Health Canada official who had signed off on an internal inquiry closure, killing the investigation before it reached anyone who might have acted on it. That official had since moved, not out of government, but through it, appointment by appointment, review by review, to a position on the Senate Committee on National Defense, Senator Paul Etheridge. The committee that oversaw the Canadian Forces Health Services Group, the same oversight structure that Strachan's operation had operated under for 3 years. He was briefed on today's Saskatoon operation at 6 this morning, Chamberlain said. 4 hours before you and I are sitting here, which means he knew we were moving on Strachan before Strachan knew, Nadia said. Yes, and you spent the day deciding whether to tell me that. I spent the day confirming the authorization chain was what the document suggested. Chamberlain had the kind of directness that came from having done a difficult job for a long time without flinching. I don't bring incomplete information. Is it complete now? It's confirmed. The internal inquiry closure from 9 years ago bears Etheridge's signature as secondary authorization. At the time, he was in a position to give the suppression order interagency weight. He used that position. She set her glasses on the table. At the time, he was publicly building a reputation on government accountability reform. He'd made that reputation partly on the strength of questioning military procurement practices, covering his tracks by performing the opposite, Nadia said. We believe he received something in return. Financial forensics are still working through the connection, but there's a pattern in his early political financing that the RCMP's commercial crime unit flagged this afternoon when they ran the cross-reference. He knows about today, Nadia said. He's been on the oversight committee the whole time. He has the procedural authority to slow any investigation that tries to reach him. Chamberlain looked at her. We have a window, she said, 48 hours before his staff connects the 9-year-old authorization chain to the current case and brings it to him directly, possibly less. Nadia looked at the highlighted name on the document. The nurse manager in Manitoba, she said, the one who reported the second incident 9 years ago. Does she know about Etheridge? Not yet. She knows we've made contact. She doesn't know the specifics. Chamberlain paused. She's willing to talk. She's been willing for 9 years. She simply didn't know who to talk to or whether it would matter. 9 years of carrying something accurate with nowhere to put it. What do you need from me? Nadia said. Your testimony establishes the current operation and its documentation chain. Her testimony, combined with the 9-year-old authorization record, establishes the pattern. Together, they create a record that survives Etheridge's committee position, because it predates and postdates his oversight role simultaneously. Chamberlain leaned forward. But there's a practical constraint. When Etheridge realizes the scope of what's being built, he'll use his committee authority to create procedural obstacles. We have 48 hours before that becomes a serious problem. What do I have to do? She called the nurse manager in Manitoba that night from her apartment, which she returned to for the first time in what felt like a week. The phone rang 4 times. A woman answered, cautious. Hello, my name is Nadia Kovač. I was a trauma nurse in Saskatchewan until last night. 9 years ago, someone buried your report to protect an operation you had stumbled into, and I have the documentation that proves it. I want to talk to you about what we can do with that. A long silence. How did you find me? The same way they found me. I kept filing accurate reports until someone noticed. Another silence. Shorter, something shifting in it. You said we, the woman said. What does that mean? It means you're not doing this alone, Nadia said. Neither am I. Neither of us ever should have been. Her name was Frances Obi. She'd been working as a nurse manager at a regional hospital in Winnipeg for 5 years, having left a federal health facility under circumstances that had been explained as a position elimination, and that she'd spent 9 years knowing was something else and being unable to prove. She had a son named Jerome who was 11 and who fell asleep during the second hour of the call, which gave the conversation a hushed quality that Nadia found unexpectedly grounding. I filed 4 reports over 5 months, Frances said. Each one more detailed than the last because I kept thinking the problem was that I hadn't given them enough specific information. I did the same thing, Nadia said. 44 reports in 8 months. Did it work? It worked differently than I intended, Nadia said. But yes. She told Frances the shape of what had happened. The grain elevator, Theo, the drive, Strachan's arrest, Etheridge's name in the authorization chain. She kept it factual and didn't editorialize. He signed the suppression order, Frances said when Nadia finished. Her voice was very controlled. Yes. And now he's on the oversight committee. Yes, a long silence. Jerome was born 4 months after I left that position, Frances said. I left because the environment had become hostile and my record had been compromised and I couldn't see a way forward. I left because I thought I had failed. She stopped. I have spent 9 years believing that I should have pushed harder. You did everything right. Nadia said. The operation was bigger than what any one person could push against alone. That's not failure. That's their design. Knowing that doesn't give back 9 years, no, Nadia said. It doesn't. She didn't try to make that less true. Some things didn't get softer just because you finally understood them. Will my testimony make a difference? Francis said. Your testimony closes the pattern, Nadia said. Without it, Etheridge argues the 9-year-old authorization was a routine administrative decision by a mid-level official acting within normal discretion. With it, it's the first documented link in a chain of deliberate suppression that ran from his first involvement to the current operation. The pattern is the evidence. I can be in Saskatoon tomorrow morning, Francis said. I need to arrange Jerome's school pickup. It was such a specific, ordinary logistical concern in the middle of something this consequential that Nadia almost laughed, not dismissively. She felt the full weight of what it meant to say, I will help dismantle a center's cover story, but first I need to sort out school pickup. I'll make sure there's somewhere for you both to stay, Nadia said. You don't have to do that. I know, Nadia said. I want to. Francis Obi arrived the next morning at 9:40 with a carry-on bag and an 11-year-old who looked at the federal agents in the lobby of the temporary field office with the frank evaluative gaze of a child who had not yet learned to pretend he wasn't assessing people. Francis herself was quieter in person than on the phone, the kind of quiet that came from processing things inward before expressing them outward. She shook Nadia's hand and held it a moment longer than a standard handshake, and looked at her with dark, steady eyes and didn't say anything. Because there wasn't a sentence that was going to capture what that handshake meant, and she clearly knew better than to try. Jerome sat in the corner of the waiting area with a book and a snack his mother had packed, and Nadia watched him periodically over the course of the morning because there was something stabilizing about the presence of an 11-year-old in a room full of federal proceedings. Jerome had no investment in any of this except that it concerned his mother. Watching him read with the complete absorption of a child who had not yet been taught to perform attention was a specific antidote to the institutional weight of everything else. Francis's deposition took 5 hours. She was a remarkably effective witness, Nadia observed through the glass partition. Not because she was dramatic, but because she wasn't. She answered questions with the precision of someone who had spent 9 years reviewing the events in her own memory and had long since separated what she knew from what she'd inferred. She cited specific dates, specific report identifiers, specific names in the notification chain she'd filed through. When the federal prosecutor asked her to describe the conversation in which she'd been advised to leave her position, she quoted it in the exact language she'd been given. Language that appeared, Nadia was told afterward, word for word in Strachan's internal operational notes about managing personnel who were generating inconvenient documentation. The prosecutor underlined it. By 2 in the afternoon, the federal investigators had enough to formally expand the scope of the inquiry to include Senator Paul Etheridge under a sealed order that would run parallel to the Strachan prosecution. The sealed structure meant his committee authority couldn't be used to interfere before the evidence was locked. The 48-hour window had been enough, barely. Chamberlain found Nadia in the hallway outside the deposition room. It held, Chamberlain said. Yes, you understand the Etheridge piece will take considerably longer than the Strachan prosecution. Sitting senators have significant procedural resources. I know. Nadia looked at the door. I have time. Chamberlain looked at her with the appraising quality she'd had since their first meeting, the look of someone taking an accurate measurement. Yount submitted a formal recommendation this morning for a consulting engagement. She paused. So did I independently. You'd be working within the Federal Health Accountability Framework, medical supply chain integrity specifically, identifying irregularities, building the evidence base, working with clinical staff who may have observed anomalies without understanding their significance. Like I was, Nadia said. Like you were, Chamberlain said. Except now you'd know what you were looking at, and you'd have the institutional support to do something about it. Nadia thought about it. Not the version of thinking about it that arrived at yes immediately, because the moment seemed to call for it. The actual version, which involved calculating what it would cost and what it would require, and whether she was genuinely built for it in the sustained, unglamorous way that real investigative work actually operated. She was 33 years old. She'd been a flight nurse. She'd worked in places she didn't name in casual conversation. She'd spent 8 months filing reports into what felt like a void and hadn't stopped. She'd kept a man alive in a grain elevator at midnight with field gear and muscle memory. She'd walked into a building in the dark knowing 2 unauthorized individuals were inside and done it anyway because the alternative was watching 7 years of documentation disappear. She wasn't fearless. She'd been afraid for most of the past 24 hours. She'd been afraid for most of the past 8 months. Fear had never been the thing that stopped her. What had stopped her the times she'd nearly stopped was not knowing whether the work mattered, not knowing if anyone was receiving it, filing into a void and wondering each time whether this was the report that finally proved she'd been wrong to keep going. That part was over. Yes, she said, I'll take the engagement. The formal charges against Howard Strachan were filed on a Thursday. 104 counts, federal fraud and conspiracy, illegal diversion of Crown property, obstruction of a federal investigation. The announcement came from Public Safety Canada and ran on every major network by noon. Nadia watched it on her laptop in the hotel room she'd been using while her apartment was swept for the surveillance equipment that had been placed there, she'd learned, over the past 6 months. Learning that had been its own thing to absorb on top of everything else. The press conference was brief. A federal spokesperson read the charges. Behind her, a summary on screen, 34 months, 30 to 50 million in diverted military medical supply, 11 co-conspirators, a network spanning military procurement and civilian hospital administration. Nadia's name didn't appear. That was by design. Her cooperation status meant her name stayed out of the public record until the prosecution team determined disclosure was tactically useful. She'd agreed to that. She wasn't interested in press conferences. She watched for Strachan's face, which the cameras found when he was walked into the federal courthouse. Dark suit, attorney beside him. The particular expression of a man who had spent 30 years being publicly important and was now being publicly something else. He didn't look at the cameras. She closed the laptop. Monahan entered a plea agreement 11 days later and cooperated fully in exchange for reduced sentencing, for financial records, communications, and contact names. His testimony corroborated and extended everything in the recovered documentation. Dr. Gwen Sato, who had delivered Nadia's termination, was charged under a separate conspiracy count supported by Monahan's testimony. She had been receiving payments through a shell account for 14 months. The amounts, when disclosed, said something about what someone had decided her cooperation was worth and how much they'd needed to pay for it. Clearwater Regional entered federal administrative oversight. The board was suspended. The senior administrative structure was removed. A court-appointed administrator took operational control while the hospital's accreditation was reviewed. Patient care continued. Hess kept working the overnight desk. The ER nurses kept showing up. That was a real thing, and Nadia thought about it a lot in the weeks that followed. The distributed cost of institutional corruption, how it was never contained to the people who designed it, how it spread through a building and a system, and the daily working lives of people who had simply been trying to do their jobs. The nursing staff who'd had nothing to do with any of it and now went to work every day into an institution whose future was being decided in federal offices 1,200 kilometers away. She thought about patients. She thought about people she'd treated over 7 years whose care might have been affected by shortages she'd been documenting, and they'd never known. She thought about that a lot. It didn't resolve into anything comfortable. It wasn't supposed to. Her employment record at Clearwater was formally reviewed as part of the conspiracy investigation. The performance case constructed against her was identified as fabricated. The patient complaint that had formed the basis of that case, a complaint she'd never been permitted to read and had spent 8 months assuming was at least partially valid in some way she couldn't account for, was traced to an administrative staff member who, under questioning, acknowledged she had been instructed to generate it. The patient named had never filed a complaint and denied doing so. She'd suspected something like that. Suspected it and pushed the suspicion away because the version of events where it was true required the world to have been a specific kind of deliberately cruel in a way that had been easier to not fully believe. The world had been exactly that deliberately cruel. The only useful thing to do with that knowledge was to carry it accurately and keep going. In February, Senator Paul Etheridge resigned from his committee positions and citing personal health reasons. The language that people used when their personal health reasons were a sealed federal investigation their attorneys had advised was no longer outrunable. The sealed order was lifted 6 weeks later. The press conference named specific counts: conspiracy, obstruction, breach of trust by a public officer, corrupt receipt of benefits, 9 years of obscured payments totaling just over $1.8 million, routed through 3 financial vehicles, campaign contributions and personal accounts. He resigned from the Senate the same afternoon. Nadia saw the photographs on her phone between patients at the hospital, where she'd been picking up shifts since January, a smaller facility 40 minutes north of Saskatoon, where she'd told the charge nurse on her first shift that she documented supply discrepancies when she found them and had been told that was absolutely encouraged, and here was the form. She looked at the photographs for about 10 seconds. Then she put her phone away and went back to work. She didn't feel triumphant. She'd thought she might. Had anticipated it the way you anticipated the feeling of putting down something heavy you'd been carrying for a long time. What she actually felt was quieter than that. The recognition that a process that should have existed had finally run its course. That was less satisfying than triumph and considerably more honest. Theo's name, she'd learned, was Theodore Garneau. He completed his recovery in early spring, ahead of the projected timeline, which his physiotherapy team attributed to a level of commitment to the rehabilitation protocol that they described as intense even by the standards of their usual patient population. He'd been a competitive cyclist before his service, which probably explained the vascular surgeon's comment about exceptional baseline cardiovascular health in a patient who'd had a significant hepatic laceration. He came to Saskatoon in April. They met at a coffee shop near the river because it seemed more appropriate than any of the official spaces that had contained all her other conversations about these events. He was quieter in person than she'd expected. He sat down across from her and looked at her with the direct quality of someone who'd been in enough situations where pretense was useless that they'd stopped attempting it in daily life. "I've been trying to figure out the right thing to say," he said, "to someone who kept you alive. I don't think there is a right thing. You don't have to say anything specific," she said. "I was doing my job. Yount told me you'd say that." She smiled slightly. "He said you'd also try to redirect the conversation to operational logistics within about 5 minutes. He's not wrong, they talked for an hour. He told her about the cycling, and she told him about the field hospital in the conflict zone she'd worked in at 24. About the first time she'd kept someone alive under conditions she hadn't been trained for, using only what she had and what she knew, with the specific feeling of not knowing whether it was going to be enough. "That feeling," he said, "does it go away?" "No," she said, "but it becomes familiar, and familiar is workable." He nodded like that was the useful answer rather than the comfortable one. He knew the difference. In May, her phone number was passed by Chamberlain's office to a nurse in Newfoundland who had flagged supply irregularities at her hospital 4 years ago, been told it was a data entry issue, and had spent 4 years half believing that because it was easier than the alternative. Nadia called her on a Tuesday evening. Her name was Bridget. She was 29. She'd almost stopped filing reports after the second one went nowhere. "I know the feeling," Nadia said. "How do you keep going when nobody's listening?" Bridget said. "You find other ways to document," Nadia said. "You get specific about item codes and receiving signatures and timestamps. You make the record so precise that it would take deliberate action to bury it rather than just institutional inertia." She paused, "And you keep going because you know what a gap in the supply cabinet means on the other end. Not abstractly, in practice. In the people who needed what wasn't there." A silence. "Were they listening?" Bridget said all along. "Was someone eventually listening?" "Eventually," Nadia said. Yes, there was another silence, and India could hear Bridget doing the same calculation she'd done, the one about whether the work mattered or whether mattering was something other people decided, whether the work was true even while someone was burying it. An accurate thing was still accurate while someone was deleting it from the active directory. The corruption had been trying to erase a record. It had never managed it. It had only ever managed to delay it. She drove home along the river road with the last of the evening light coming off the South Saskatchewan in long, flat bars, the prairie sky enormous and streaked with the particular colors of a May sunset at this latitude, and she thought about what she had and what it had cost and whether the math worked out. It didn't. The math on these things never balanced if you tried to treat it like a ledger. You couldn't put 8 months of professional erasure on one side and a federal consulting role and a corrected employment record on the other and call them even. You couldn't put Renee Thibault, 27 years old, in a column and find an entry that compensated. You couldn't give Frances Obi her 9 years back. You couldn't tell the patients whose care had been affected what they had been owed. None of that was erasable. But she'd also learned something in the past several months that she hadn't fully understood before. She'd spent years believing that whether the work mattered was something other people determined. Supervisors, administrators, men in offices with the authority to decide which record stood and which got quietly removed. She'd believed that her job was to do the work correctly and trust that the people receiving it would receive it correctly, and when they didn't, she'd tried to find the failure in herself. She'd been wrong about that. The work had mattered every single time. The May report with the procurement code. The 44 variance reports that mapped the diversion timeline. The 3 photographs taken in a darkened office before someone could stop her. The 11 minutes on a concrete floor that kept a person's blood pressure viable long enough for the next thing to happen. Every one of those had mattered. The fact that certain people had been actively working to make them not matter didn't change what they were. A true thing remained true while someone was trying to bury it. She'd been exactly ordinary enough. That was the lesson. Not the satisfying version where she'd been remarkable in some clear, measurable way, where a specific gift had made the difference. The actual lesson was less comfortable and more durable. that the difference between things changing and not changing was often just someone with accurate observations and the stubbornness to keep making them after it stopped being reasonable. She'd almost stopped in February. She'd sat in the break room one Tuesday afternoon in February and thought seriously about stopping, and then she'd gone home and slept and come back and written the next report. Not because she'd seen what was coming, not because she'd understood what she was holding. She'd done it because the alternative was letting a wrong thing stay wrong while she had the capacity to do something about it, and she hadn't been able to live with that. The ordinary stubbornness of someone who knew that gaps in a supply cabinet had names, that had been enough. She pulled into her parking spot and sat for a moment with the engine off. Chamberlain had sent her a preliminary flag that morning about irregularities in medical supply restocking reported by 2 separate clinical staff members at a federal corrections facility in Ontario. Small discrepancies, the kind that could be administrative error, the kind that could be something else. She'd attach her notes to the file in the morning. She'd flag the item codes that matched known diversion patterns. She'd do it in the precise language she'd always used, because imprecise language disappeared without a trace, and she'd been doing this long enough now to know exactly what language stayed. Some stories ended with a ceremony and a commendation and someone handing you something in a frame. This one ended with a nurse sitting in a parking lot, reviewing a supply discrepancy flag before going inside to make dinner, thinking about item codes and restocking patterns, and a federal corrections facility in Ontario she hadn't visited yet. It ended with a woman who'd been told she was replaceable deciding that ordinary precision was never the insult they'd meant it to be. It ended the way most actual change ended. Not with a clean line, but with a tilt, a slow shift in who held the weight. The people who'd decided she was a problem were sitting in federal court. The people who'd needed her to stop had lost their committee seats and their decorated careers, and the carefully maintained public stories they'd built on the quiet suppression of other people's accurate work. And the nurse they'd all decided was nothing kept showing up and kept writing it down. That was the whole thing. That was enough.